morning, everyone. My name is Arvind Narayanan. I'm a computer science professor at Princeton. I'm visiting the Knight Institute this year, and it's my honor to be co-organizing this symposium. Now, we know that the design of online platforms powerfully shapes how information propagates online. Recommendation algorithms are going to inevitably amplify some speech and suppress others. I mean, if they didn't, they would be useless. That's why we have them. But at the same time, amplification has both good and bad effects. A protest against injustice may be amplified, but so might misinformation. And different groups might benefit from amplification to different degrees. Because of all this, the stakes for society are high. The question of what it is that platform designers should optimize for isn't one that should be left entirely to private companies. And I think that's why we're here today. And tomorrow, by the way. It's a different room tomorrow. I just wanted to mention, make sure to check your email. So given everything that's been happening in the social media space recently, this event feels particularly timely. It's great to see a lot of interest. Over 1,000 people have registered for viewing this online. And so really appreciate that all of you are participating. So this is the first of 6 panels. Some of the speakers on these panels were invited because of a recent paper that they published or important work they did. Most of the speakers were selected through a competitive process and have written papers specifically for this symposium. And those papers are going to be published on the Knight Institute website in the next few months. When we were organizing this, we thought if we got a few legal scholars and computer scientists together, it would be interdisciplinary, but we ended up getting interest from over a dozen different disciplines. It's an incredible group of people, and I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome our panelists. So let me tell you a little bit about the panelists. Tomo Lazovich is a senior research scientist at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University, while also getting a law degree. And before that, they were a senior machine learning researcher at Twitter in the ML Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability team. Tarleton Gillespie is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. He's also affiliated with Cornell University. He is very well known for his book, Custodians of the Internet, Platforms, Content Moderation, and the Hidden Decisions That Shape Social Media. It's a must-read for folks interested in these topics, and he's been looking at this set of questions for more than a decade. Daphne Keller is at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. She directs the platform on program regulation, and her work focuses on platform regulation as well as internet users' rights. Before that, she was the Associate General Counsel for Google. And so all 3 panelists bring deep experience on this topic and have looked at this both from academic and industry perspectives. So the goal of this panel is to set the stage for the event. We're going to discuss the basics of how platforms and platform algorithms work, lay out what the issues are that we're talking about, review some recent developments, and look at some of the legal questions as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Tomo. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion, and we'll have audience questions as well. Where's the... Okay, it'll be on the screen. I'll tell you about how to ask questions when that comes up, but there are also mics set up here. Okay, thank you.
Do you want me up there? Or?
Whatever's more comfortable.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tomo Lazovich. As Arvind said, I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern. I'm filling in today for Christian Lum, who was sick and couldn't make it, so I will do my best to channel my inner Christian in this presentation. So this panel is all about level setting, and the paper that Christian and I wrote is really about, today we're talking about algorithmic amplification. What do we mean when we say there is an algorithm? What is the algorithm that people are always talking about? So to start, I want to start with just kind of a baseline definition of what a lot of people mean when they talk about algorithmic amplification. And as we'll see through the various sessions, I'm sure, today and tomorrow, there are a ton of different ways you could define algorithmic amplification, but often it's defined in this way, which is basically trying to understand the extent to which the algorithm is promoting certain content over other content compared to some neutral baseline. And so as we're level setting here, I want to focus both on what is the algorithm and what is the neutral baseline. Does it even ever really exist? Spoiler alert, no. So one of the things that we really wanted to do with this work is to start off by showing what I call the model spaghetti monster that is behind most social media platforms that you're looking at. Because typically, when people are talking about the algorithm, they're thinking about the part of a system that ranks the content that you see. You know, it will put some post over another because it's likely been optimized for engagement and it thinks that you'll be interested in that. But in actuality, there's a lot of other stuff that is influencing what you see when you go on social media. So, for example, that box in the middle left there, content ranking models, that's often what people mean. But you can't usually actually rank every possible thing that would show up on someone's timeline. There's hundreds of millions of posts happening every day. So before you even get to the point where you're trying to figure out what a person might like compared to something else, you need to do something called candidate generation, where you're thinking more about, let me narrow down these hundreds of millions to a set of maybe thousands or tens of thousands that I'm then going to run through my more computationally intensive ranking model to then generate your timeline. So that's the box in the bottom left there. But then there's also all kinds of other things going on social networks. We know, in general, there are more surfaces that you interact with than just the main feed. There's search. There's usually something like an explore or discovery tab where you can find new or trending content. There's surfaces that recommend accounts to follow that aren't really about content at all. There's also notifications that you can get about things that might be trending if you have that turned on. And so all of those are also surfaces that can promote or de-promote certain content, and they're driven usually by their own algorithms that are also fed by some of the same things that content ranking box is fed by. And then on top of all of that, you also have the policies that the platform has put in place, whether that's sort of manual business rules, things like we don't want to show you 3 ads in a row in your timeline because that probably means you won't stick around for very long, to models that are trying to understand whether your content is explicitly violating platform policies or is illegal, or if it's in this gray area that's called toxic content where it's not actively violating the policies of the platform, but it's still content that maybe you don't want to promote. It's sort of marginal. It might be abusive or offensive even if it's not violating the sort of terms of service or something like that. So there's models that are trying to figure out all of that as well. There's also, for the more technical folks in the room, there's a ton of what machine learning people call embedding models that are really trying to capture the attributes of, say, a user or the content that they post and embed that into a space where you can then make comparisons and use that to feed a downstream model for something else. And then the last point I just want to make is all of that is actually conditioned on the state of the follow network in the bottom right there, which is this network of who has opted in to seeing another person's content. And that's always constantly evolving, and user behavior engagement is feeding into all these things and creating feedback loops. And so it really is just a spaghetti monster at the end of the day. There's all these different things happening. And so the point is that when you're talking about algorithmic amplification, there is no the algorithm. There's a set of interdependent models that are very hard to disentangle causally, and so you really need to be careful in terms of when you're doing comparisons, what you're bringing in and which parts of the system might affect the outputs that you're seeing. So that brings us to the second part of that algorithmic amplification definition, which is we often try to compare to some neutral baseline. What does that baseline that is actually neutral? Does it even exist? So the most common thing to do, and I think it's probably one of the best, like the closest things you can get to neutral, even though it's not actually neutral, is to compare an algorithmically ranked timeline, so something where there's this active ranking and sorting step as part of the whole process, to something that's often called reverse chronological. This is an option, for example, on Twitter, where you only see content from people you follow, so you've opted in to see that content, and there's no active ranking that happens. It's just the most recent tweets from people you follow show up first, and it kind of goes chronologically from there. So that seems like a reasonable baseline because there's no content ranking model box in that part of the timeline. But there's still a lot of those other boxes in the diagram that are affecting it, and one in particular that really kind of hurts the neutrality of that baseline is that follow network, because you're still only seeing accounts that you followed. So if, for example, there was a bias or some sort of wrongful amplification happening in the model that recommends accounts to follow, then that would sort of be absorbed into your baseline, and then it's not really a neutral baseline anymore. So to give a specific recent example of that, something that, that was observed on Twitter, there seems to have been recently a policy change with the change of ownership, such that there was a huge uptick starting around March in the number of follows that state-affiliated media accounts were getting. This plot here is showing Russia's RT, which around March started to have this big uptick. And there was a formal change in the policy that was published on April 6th. It seems like the change was actually happening before that, but now this is just an example. So there's this account that is all of a sudden getting all of these new follows. So what does that mean? Well, that means anybody who is following that account, now if you're comparing, say, their reverse chronological timeline to the algorithmic timeline, both of those timelines are going to have content from this state-affiliated media in it, which means that all of a sudden your neutral, not really neutral baseline has absorbed this effect where all of a sudden state-affiliated media accounts were getting promoted more. And so you're not going to measure, with that definition of amplification, you're not going to measure Russia's RT as being amplified, but in fact they were amplified in some sense compared to the history. It just wasn't in the part of the system that you're turning on and off when you're comparing algorithmic timeline to reverse chron. So that's just one example of the way that, and really the point of our paper is you really have to be careful in understanding exactly, if you're going to compare to a baseline, you have to be really careful in understanding what you're including in that baseline and what assumptions are getting baked into that. And on top of that, you know, you probably want to consider if what you're really worried about is a specific kind of harm, say, you know, extremist content being promoted, it might be better to just measure the raw volume of that rather than doing this comparison to a baseline in the first place, because at the end of the day, there's all these assumptions that are baked into that baseline anyway. And so I'll leave it there and give us time for discussion and questions, but happy to discuss more about all this. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. I wanted to point out I'm not going to give the talk that's listed in the conference presentation by a quirky, half-purposeful fluke. If you search "do not recommend Tarleton," I'm the first thing that comes up. If you want to read the paper, I highly recommend that you do that. But I wanted to sort of draw a starting point to a set of questions that I think are going to run through this conference. And for those of you who are concerned about algorithmic amplification from various disciplines, as Arvind pointed out, I feel like these need to be part of the starting point. We know that a broad discussion is underway about the impact of social media platforms and the providers of culture and information. This is part of what Dr. Nelson described, the digital polycrisis. I'm going to lose sleep over that phrase too. And questions of like, what are these platforms and information intermediaries designed to do? How are these values and aims implemented? And what consequences do they have and for whom? And this is a broad kind of politics of technology question. What do these systems tend to do? And it should involve questions about algorithms, but also interface design and content policies, leadership, market pressures, et cetera. And then as part of that, I think there's a more specific question, which is how do largely search and recommendation algorithms, the pieces that Toro just pointed out, as part of these platforms, as part of this optimization to serve up content to users in these kind of specific and opaque ways, how do they end up having aggregate consequences for what kinds of content tends to enjoy amplification, tends to gain visibility? And we could think of this as a subset of that sort of impact of platforms question, or we could think of it as like a broader question, right? What are the secondary, aggregate, and public ramifications of our societal commitment to algorithmically mediated information landscapes? So that could take us way outside of platforms in terms of who gets resources, who gets access. Either way, it's a question that is about comparative advantage. So what wins and what loses in this game of visibility because of the design and the weights of these algorithmic systems. So there are really important technical questions that are going to be asked as part of this conversation. How do these effects occur and where do they actually live in this complicated system? Important legal and policy questions to ask, sort of how accountability should be assigned given this distribution of information, what outcomes could be induced that might be better. And I'm going to leave those to others for the next couple of minutes. I want to highlight what I think of as sociocultural questions that I think run through the rest of this conference. And if you don't like the soft word socioculture, you can say public questions that animate some of these things. And I want to highlight them as a separate category because they ask us to do a couple things in the way we ask and answer questions. The first is that we, in some ways, have to resist putting the algorithm and the platform in the kind of explanatory center, right? These are bigger questions to which these systems are a part. At the same time, we don't want to absolve the platforms and the algorithms from having deep implications for how these systems work. We also have to ask these questions amidst efforts by powerful tech companies to answer them for us. I think that's a really important part of this puzzle. These questions to me are the following. Why do some things circulate more than others and with what consequences? I'm writing it broadly so we get away from whatever specific information system. This is a question about the tactics of individual distributors. It's also a question about the tastes and practices of users and publics. When we see surges of interest, are they authentic, are they manufactured, or if they are both, how does that work? This also forces us to ask questions not about single platforms. This is a real problem for those of us who actually want to do empirical work because we often lock into a platform that can tell us something. But these dynamics that we actually care about are cross-platform, multi-platform. They, in fact, move through entire fields of stakeholders, platforms and others. How do these ecosystems get gamed by interested parties? So that could be creators, that could be advertisers, political figures, and states, propagandists. How do they begin to make sense of those dynamics and use them to their advantage? And then how would that circulation system be different if it were structured by different priorities? And these are big questions about market power, about professional obligation, about state oversight. And they're implicitly questions about what makes a healthy public. What should we amplify? And when we say what should we amplify, we always have to ask who should be making that decision and who has the power to make that decision. And to me, it's important. Silicon Valley has a very presentist tendency. They think they invented all of this stuff, and they think that everything past was exactly what they got rid of, and thank God for that. But I think these are questions that did not begin with social media and with algorithms. In fact, they're fundamental questions that we've long asked about media and public life. They are fundamental to the dilemma that most of the information we get and need come from somewhere else, which means we are dependent on the systems that deliver them to us, which means the way they deliver them to us are important, essential, and often problematic. And we might play a game here where we could sort of like anachronistically think about like, how have we asked amplification questions all along, right? Why is American news so focused on American topics? Why are superhero movies so dominant? Why do non-English pop songs not do well in the US? Why are Korean pop and Spanish language pop having breakthroughs and not others, right? Does peer review guarantee the best scholarship? Do Canadians see enough Canadian-produced film and television? And how do we continue to miss the mark on cultural representation when it comes to race or age or sexuality or gender identity? These old questions or long-standing questions, persistent questions, again, anachronistically, we could call parts of them algorithmic. And I'm bending the definition, but I'm doing it on purpose. So when we say, what news values animate American newsrooms such that certain topics seem to rank higher in their likelihood of appearing or being pursued, being published, appearing on the front page or not on the front page? What metrics of user interest and taste are being attended to and valued highly? Are those ratings? Are those ticket sales? Is that fan chatter online? What mechanisms start to make sense at the individual level, but then end up having aggregate effects that we are more concerned about? And there are familiar questions in here about the interconnectedness about these dynamics, right? User taste, user activity, and the workings of the mechanism that are designed to circulate that content. And we think of algorithms as being sort of feedback loops, but we've always had feedback loops, right? Interest in a particular band in a specific city justifies that the promoter sends them there to play there. That justifies an ad push and some media appearances. That ups their perceived popularity, increases chatter about the band, right? Signals that there's more interest in that city. Is that an authentic surge of interest that was well served? Or is that an artificial and self-fulfilling bubble? What if it's both? And it gets us to similar existential questions. Is popularity a good proxy for quality? What forms of culture and knowledge overly benefit from assuming that the one equals the other? What do we do about the mismatch between what we want and what we feel we should want? Right? And how do we honor the rights and wants of individuals and at the same time care for the health of the collective? Now, obviously, there are key differences when we get to the algorithmic. I'm not pretending that it's all the same thing. In particular, we are rapidly embracing a system where these logics of circulation are largely technically instantiated, and that means a couple things. User engagement, whatever is being paid attention to, that data is plentiful. It's being used as feedback. It can be used quite instantly, and by a mechanism that is incredibly malleable and responsive. Right? It also means a broadening of who produces, which means that the mechanisms we had before about what ended up making it there in the first place and the power of gatekeepers seems diminished. And so there's much more attention to who can shape the contours of what actually circulates, right? Amplify. I think it also points out, but nevertheless, those who circulate culture publicly always are balancing serving the public and serving private fortune. These are often at odds, and it's not always easy to tell how they're at odds. And they can be justifications or defenses for each other. So it's easy for providers to say, we give people what they want, or the algorithm said so, right? And that becomes a justification. It plays into the very debate we're having and works as a kind of defense for a practice that is both giving people what they want and not at the same time. I'll leave you one last thought, because I think this comparison to long-standing media questions should remind us of another thing, which is that media distribution systems, and I'm including social media platforms, they don't like thinking themselves as media companies, but I think they are. Media is designed to amplify. That's what it does, right? So when we object to amplification, we are not objecting to amplification per se. There's plenty of good amplification. We're glad when someone reads our tweet that we wanted them to. We're glad that a band gets an audience. We're glad that a movie is seen by people who appreciate it. What we're always asking about the concerns of amplification is amplification we don't approve of, amplification that we think shouldn't be amplified, and the cumulative amplification effects of individual optimizations. And that means that we're always left with a relative question or a comparative question in the end. Amplified more than what? This is this question of the baseline, right? More than it would have been otherwise? Then we're stuck with a problem of saying that, like, what we thought was the norm is something that's already been built for us. We've spent a decade paying attention to platforms telling us what we should expect about popularity and virality and reach, right? So we're objecting to not getting what they promised us. More than would have been justified by authentic interest. Well, cultural studies and media studies will tell us there is no such thing as authentic interest. We always develop taste and pursue interest inside of a menu and a cultural environment and an expectation about what is available, not available. So I'm left with saying more than is healthy, right? Once again, we get back to this question about that we are asking a hard question about what we wish we had from our information landscape and what we actually get. And then we're always left with questions, healthy for whom, healthy at what cost, and on the basis of whose judgment, which again leaves us with who can ask these questions and who has the standing to demand change. Thanks.
So I love this conference because there are so few lawyers. This is not like my usual conference, but it's also kind of a funny time to have an amplification conference that's not crawling with lawyers, because literally right now the Supreme Court is trying to decide whether platforms should face liability for content that they amplify or that they rank with their algorithms. And here we are at a conference with technologists and social scientists and experts telling us there is no coherent definition of the algorithm that like you can start with for that analysis. There is no coherent definition of amplification. And that's all because, as Tomo was saying, there's no coherent definition or agreement on what the baseline is of what things are supposed to be that you then compare and say, you know, the platform amplified other things. And part of that problem is no matter, this is something I really got from the scholarship of Tomo and Christian Lum, who's not able to be here, is that the baseline of who you already follow, which is what you get if you're looking at reverse chronological order, that bakes in every bias, every assumption, everything you brought with you to arrive at following some people and not others, or knowing about some people and not others. And so if that's the baseline, then it is always amplifying to bring in voices you hadn't heard of before. Like you don't get Lil Nas X showing up in your timeline. You don't get Me Too showing up in your timeline. You only get whatever you already knew about. And that, I think, is really concerning. And to understand all of this and to make actual nuanced policy, we need exactly what Professor Nelson told us we needed, which is transparency, better researcher access to data, more ability to do the kind of work that we're hearing about at this conference. So what I can bring to this discussion is the part about law. And I want to make the case that making platforms liable for amplification, just bluntly defined, is a terrible way to make law and is in many cases also unconstitutional. One reason that it's a terrible way to respond to a lot of the problems that we're talking about is that a lot of the online content that we're concerned about is not illegal. You can't use the law to prevent platforms from hosting or amplifying most hate speech, pro-anorexia material, pro-suicide material, awful stuff, most beheading videos, Holocaust denial. There's all this stuff that most people, I think across the political spectrum, this isn't actually a left-right issue, most people don't want to see on platforms, but you can't use the law to make that happen because this is lawful but awful First Amendment protected speech. I have a UChicago Law Review article about that if you're interested in that topic. And so even if we move to a world of saying you have to stop amplifying certain things, platforms, we would still have this profound cultural divide about what exactly should be de-amplified within this category of lawful but awful speech that the law can't speak to. Then there's the stuff that's actually illegal, and there is plenty of stuff that is actually illegal. There's actual defamation, there's true threats, et cetera. We actually know a lot about what happens when platforms are told under law that they have to remove illegal things, they have to delete them, and what happens if you have just like a blunt obligation to do that and no further protections for users is that platforms go way overboard and they take down way too much content. Anything that is alleged to be illegal, anything that is controversial, we know that there seem to be patterns erring on the side of taking down speech by marginalized groups. We know that even in systems where users get notice and an opportunity to appeal, there are probably patterns where men appeal more than women. There's just sort of this big set of problems that come with platform liability for user speech, those can be offset. There are lots of interesting things in EU law, for example, about how to handle that. But that whole set of problems, it doesn't go away if you move from a law that says platforms must delete this speech to platforms must demote this speech. You just get that whole set of problems affecting who shows up in the most valuable real estate on the platform, who's in the recommendations, who is in the ranked feed. And so if we can't solve those problems, or rather, whatever our tools are for solving those problems under laws that say, hey, platforms, you have to delete this, those same tools matter for a rule that says, hey, platforms, you have to demote this. Like, we're not escaping those problems by talking about amplification. And if you think about it, if platforms were capable of accurately identifying what speech is actually illegal, which sometimes, they are, sometimes they come close, then make them take it down. Like, it's not reasonable to say, we assume you can figure out what's illegal and now just demote it. Talking about amplification there doesn't help. And just to be super clear, the rights at issue there arguably are the speech rights of the platforms. Like, that's one whole argument they're making in these cases. But much more importantly, it's your speech rights. It's mine. It's the people whose speech is going to no longer be disseminated to a wide audience as a result of changes like this. And it turns out that under US First Amendment precedent, if state action causes speech to get a reduced audience, that is just as problematic as if state action causes the speech to disappear. Laws that burden speech, in the Supreme Court's parlance, get the exact same scrutiny as laws that ban speech. So you have to think about amplification rules and regular old deletion rules the same way. There's another variant on this that I think is very interesting but very hard to do in the US, which is to say, look, there is some speech that is lawful offline, things that you could say in a bar or at a conference, but that becomes much more harmful when it's online because it is persistent or because it reaches a wider audience, et cetera. And so maybe there should be this category of speech that used to be legal, but now it's illegal online, or it's illegal to amplify. Like, we want a different set of rules for previously lawful speech that platforms are going to apply when deciding what to do in their ranking algorithms. That's interesting. That's kind of what the UK can't make up its mind what it's trying to do, but on some days, that's kind of what the UK is trying to do with their new law. The problem with that, I mean, aside from whether you want to make a new swath of speech legally regulated that wasn't before, the problem is that creates a bunch of new rules, and nobody knows what they are because there's no precedent for them. And who is going to decide how to apply those new rules to billions of people and their online speech? It's not going to be courts. It's not going to be regulators. It's going to be platforms, behind the scenes building up their own internal rules about these, new restrictions on speech. I have a lot of thoughts on that I would love to go into later about when and whether platforms can make that more of a public decision by choosing to litigate over these things, but I'll set that aside. The third set of possible ways that an amplification law could play out, so we talked about, number one, the law saying don't amplify illegal things. Number two, the law saying previously legal things now cannot be amplified. And number three is saying, look, we just want an across-the-board circuit breaker. This isn't about identifying any particular speech and stopping demoting it. This is about a quantitative limit that any post can't have more than X new views per hour, or there can't be more than a Y% increase in number of followers per week, or whatever. My take on those kinds of rules is meh. Like, I don't think they get us that much. They're useful for a limited case of viral misinformation about breaking news, something like that. But they also would generate a lot of false positives for things that are suddenly becoming very popular because they are pop songs, or because they are, again, like Lil Nas X breaking in from the margins. And if what you do is say nobody can increase in popularity too fast, you effectively lock in whoever already has the microphone, and again, don't make good room for new voices. So Is this hopeless? It's not hopeless. It might be hopeless for lawyers. There's this Kafka line. So apparently somebody asked him, do you really think there's no hope in the universe? And he said, oh, there's infinite hope, just not for us. And that is sometimes, that's actually the position you want the lawyers to be in a certain amount of the time. We are surrounded by all of these great technologists and social scientists and people who are thinking creatively about different ways to approach this problem that don't necessarily have to use the tools of law, but that can really move us forward, particularly if we use the tools of law to provide the transparency so these researchers can do their work and come up with new ideas. So I think we actually, this is a day of optimism. Can I say that? But maybe not for the lawyers. Thanks.
All right. Through these 3 wonderful talks, we have convincingly established that amplification is not a coherent concept. So the rest of the conference is canceled, everybody. I have a lot of questions, but also I want to say there's a QR code there if you want to put questions in, and folks on YouTube can put questions into the chat, and those will show up here on my iPad. I wanted to see if the speakers want to react to each other's talks a little bit. If not, I can launch in with questions.
I loved your talks.
Okay.
Same.
Great. Sounds good. Let me perhaps start with Daphne, since your remarks are fresh in our minds. You mentioned the EU a couple of times, but would love to hear more, especially for people who are not following that closely. There's a lot of action going on there, so if you could maybe briefly bring us up to speed.
Yeah, there's so much action going on. So I'm just going to focus on the Digital Services Act because that is this once-in-a-generation overhaul of the laws governing platforms and content moderation. And it is about to come into effect. The biggest platforms are going to have to start complying starting in August. So it will be very interesting. And it has many, many parts that I won't get into here, but some relevant parts for this event include obligations to provide more explanations about how algorithms are working and for users to opt out of personalized targeting by algorithms for the biggest platforms. And it also has just a lot of really interesting transparency provisions. Probably the most interesting one. So there are mandates to have regular statistical aggregate reports about what content has been taken down and why, and then how many were appealed, because now users must be able to appeal these decisions, and what the results of those appeals were, et cetera, et cetera. There are obligations to explain the speech rules in the first place much more clearly. There are obligations to explain to any individual user why a particular piece of content was removed, demoted, demonetized, et cetera. And then for this room, there are obligations to hand over data that the platforms hold and the rest of us don't get to see for use in analyzing whether they're complying with the law or whether they are properly mitigating the risks that the DSA is supposed to account for. It'll take, I want to say it's 18, 24 months out before this will actually start happening, but there will be a process to vet researchers to get access to this internally held data, and that might just completely overhaul what we know and how we're able to think about this.
Thank you, very interesting. If I could go to Tarleton, you've looked at this for a very long time, and I was curious if you have a sense of how platform companies thinking on these topics and what they do about harmful content and amplification, et cetera, has changed over the years. And maybe that's an opportunity for you to talk about your paper as well. I would love to hear about that a little bit.
I can do
that is
one of the main
developments.
I mean, I think I was really glad that Tomo's diagram, the spaghetti diagram, had content moderation in there, because one of the things that I think has happened is that a number of the platforms are quite aware of the accusation that they are not just homes for problematic content, but amplifying problematic content, and are getting that critique. Whether they're acting on that critique is a whole other question. Some of them have been engaged in what in the paper I call reduction. Critics have called it shadow banning. I think that reduction is a better word for it. You can read the paper. But it's an important recognition, not only because it's now become a key feature of what content moderation does. That's important. but also because I think that we have a tendency, and maybe because they were historically separate, to think about moderation and recommendation as separate components. They generated in different ways in different technical fields. They still happen generally in different parts of these companies. But in the end, when we need to understand the system and we need to ask questions about amplification, they are not only actually drifting together, right? So most of the platforms that we now use are regularly engaged in categories of toxic content or troubling content, that what they'd like to do is not remove it, but they would like to just recommend it less or not at all. And that's what I mean by reduction. And there's lots of ways that they can engage in doing that. And even the teams, the moderation teams and the algorithmic recommendation teams are starting to overlap or interact with each other, or at least pass what they're doing back to each other. There's still lots of kind of corporate blockage between those practices. But I think from an analytical point of view, I think it's almost, we can analytically talk about them as separate things, that's okay. But I think we could also analytically refuse to talk about them as separate things, and that is a productive thing to do too. Because if we think about what you take out, what you never allow, what you discourage, what you include but rarely show, what you include but show a lot, what you put on the front page, and what you announce as your favorite thing, are all techniques to modulate what we end up seeing and what we imagine the platform is there to show us. Right? And so they become, whether they're done in different places, whether they depend on different techniques, whether they're beginning to overlap, from an analytical point of view, they are part of the puzzle in understanding this kind of give and take between we engage in these systems, we get what we want, and we're also troubled by what we get, right? And that kind of discomfort. How do we then call them on it? I'm very concerned about the way that their definitions, their ability to say, well, that's moderation, that's toxic, that's, recommendation, is another way to kind of like fishtail through these concerns that we raise for them.
Very interesting, thank you. I have tons more questions, but I'm going to just ask one quick question to Tomo and then go to the questions from the participants, of which there are so many. I'm not even sure if we'll be able to get to all of them. So I was curious, Tomo, I don't know how much you can talk about your time at Twitter, but one thing I've noticed, continuing on the theme of recent developments, is that there has been so much structural pressure on many platforms to make algorithmic recommendations even more central to how the feed works. It's the TikTok model is being borrowed by many different companies, and Twitter has been doing this recently. Is that just an Elon Musk thing, or was that already in the works when you were there?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I can't talk too much about like internal discussions, but I think there are a couple of public-facing things from well before the Elon stuff started happening that are evidence that there was a push to go in that direction. So the first was, I think it was around March of last year, there was a kind of subtle change in the mobile apps where if you had set to have the reverse chronological timeline as your default, it wasn't automatically the default anymore. You would have to push a button to switch to it from the ranked feed, but every time you reopen the app, you would get the ranked feed again. And so that's like one small example of a UI change that's kind of trying to push you to consume content from the algorithmic feed, and there was a lot of backlash about that from Twitter users, and they ended up reverting the change. So that's one example of like, okay, we're trying to get that personalized content front and center. The other thing is something that I like to call the shirts that go hard problem that happened. If you are a very active Twitter user, you might remember at some point last summer, a lot of people were noticing that they were seeing a lot more really like hyper viral content in their timelines, and one of the main accounts was this account called Shirts That Go Hard, which was just memes with shirts that have like punny slogans or stuff like that on them. But people were seeing a lot more of like that, or like really viral cat memes and stuff like that, and less of stuff from people they were following. And again, that kind of abated over time, but there was this period of time where people were noticing that here's this like real substantive change in the composition of my timeline. And again, that's sort of evidence of behind the scenes, there's all these tweaks happening to try to increase personalization, and maybe something went a little wrong, and so it's actually just trying to get more out-of-network content into your timeline, but as a result, it's promoting this hyperviral stuff. So those are just a couple examples of, like, yes, there was a push towards trying to make these personalized algorithms more central to the experience.
I guess I'm not on Twitter nearly enough. I never saw any of those shirts. All right, so let's go to the audience questions. This question is not directed at anyone, so I welcome anyone to take a stab at it. Should the user be allowed to choose which algorithm affects their feed from a list of options, such as reverse chron or one of the algorithms? I guess you can look at it from a legal perspective, technical perspective, any kind of.
We debate a lot about. We think about the reverse chronological as this kind of like intellectual baseline because so few of the platforms are doing it anymore. I think it would be such an easy move to say, this solves nothing, what I'm going to say, but to at least say, of course we should have multiple algorithms. Of course we should. And of course reverse chronological should be available. Not because it's better, and not because it like answers the problem of amplification. And to pretend that it would, it mistakes the fact that like once it was available, we'd also have people building for it, right? And then wouldn't be some natural thing. But like what's happened to us as information consumers that we don't demand to say, I signed up to follow these 300 people, I should have a feed that just gives me everything. And what poor information fiduciaries the platforms have been to take the promise of sort of like initial ideas of the web, which wasn't just loads of content for everybody, but it was you'd have the kind of tools and data to organize that information, and that would be powerful and would let you build communities. So I hear these discussions about like, should there be more algorithms? It's like, of course there should. Like, that should just be, we should already have a system where there are 10 kinds of algorithms. We would learn a lot more about what's not there if we knew that we could flip through them and see that there was a difference. Not that that would, reveal anything in some sort of easy way, but it's like, of course that should be there. That should be an asset. And all these discussions about having researchers gain access to data, like just having your reverse chronological would let any user see something about the process by which their ranking is acting, because they would have something to compare to. Not neutral, not base, not perfect, but just something else.
So I think there's a much more aggressive version of this that I like. This is what my Stanford colleague Francis Fukuyama calls middleware. So the idea is not just that the existing big incumbent platforms make some different options for you to choose from, but instead that they have to open up space for competitors to come in and offer a different competing ranking algorithm or different competing content moderation rules. So you can choose rules from your church, rules ranking that is what ESPN suggests, something suggested by a feminist organization, et cetera. You have options, and the options come from competing parties. And the big upside of this, it has upsides and downsides. We could have a whole conference. In fact, we did. The last time I was at Columbia was for a whole conference on how this might work. But one of the big upsides is it takes away the just like centralized chokehold on discourse that comes from having just a couple of companies provide these algorithms and the content moderation. It diversifies the sources and gives users ability to make more choices. So I like this idea because it does not run into the same First Amendment problems I was just describing. It's not. It would face many legal challenges, but like if there were competition legislation that said, hey, platforms, you have to allow this to happen, that isn't the government dictating what content you see or even indirectly dictating what content you see. That's a competition law. If there were privacy legislation that said, because of your rights to control how platforms use your data, you can demand this of them, maybe that's a way of getting at this idea. Just fundamentally, it depends on empowering consumers more to make different choices about what discursive systems they want to opt into, rather than the idea that there's sort of going to be top-down mandates from the law saying what the speech rules need to be.
That's great. Thank you. Here's the next one's a computer science question for Tomo from Fernando Diaz. We're seeing engineers wanting to optimize systems end-to-end, removing subsystems like candidate generation and content moderation. Whether or not that's realistic, that's the vision. So what does that mean for amplification or transparency? Would things be better or worse in this future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this push for end-to-end optimization is driven a lot by the success of deep learning and the deep learning revolution and machine learning, because that is very much the kind of motivation of that technique, where we don't need to think about hand constructing features from our data anymore or anything like that. We're just going to take the raw pixels in an image and it's going to tell you what it is, and we optimize that model end to end. And so what I think that end-to-end optimization does in the end, though, is it really it limits the number of people who have the capacity to build systems that do that. Like when you see, again, using deep learning as the example, like OpenAI or Google, or there's only a few companies in the world that have the computational resources, the data resources to do this end-to-end optimization, because those techniques are often so data hungry. Like the whole kind of ethos of the technique is just throw data in, get model out, sort of. And so I think thinking in the amplification space, when you start to move end to end in that sense, I think it could have a similar effect where you start maybe ignoring some of the subtleties of the data that you're using, or you end up requiring more and more computational power to actually do that end-to-end optimization. So it's a tough question, but the systems right now aren't doing great, so it's hard to tell what the outcome of that would be.
And Arvind, we also have to, we always have to remember the idea of what the technical system does is always a mythos, right? So even the model that Tomo shows, super complicated, is not telling a story about how for every innovation that the platforms make for how to handle this technically, they're also innovating on how to do side processes that take things out of that system, right? So, we know from the way content moderation works that not everybody goes through the same system, and Facebook has a cross-check program that makes people, be reviewed differently, and Stephen King gets a blue check even though he wasn't supposed to, and Elon Musk stuff gets circulated widely. So anytime we have a go well, what if the technical system were different? I always want to go, there will also be innovations in how to create caveats and exceptions next to that. So we'll never actually be dealing with that system we're describing, we'll be dealing with that system in practice, right? And we never can get away from that part of it too, if we really want to understand the costs.
Oh, great points. Thank you. There are already more than 20 questions here. I'll try to get to as many as I can, but also if people want to come to the mic, I'm happy to get to you after the next question. So I'm going to double up 2 questions for Daphne, because there are a lot of legislation questions. So the first one from Laura Edelson is, you mentioned one area of hope was around transparency. Can you say more specifically about what transparency requirements could be viable in the US? And then, do you mind if I give you another one? Sorry, there's just so many legal questions here. Another one from Virginia Dignam is, regulation in the EU and US seems to be kind of working against each other. Are there any hopes to get them to work together?
I think those questions go together. So maybe I'll start with the second one, because I think there are a lot of things in the DSA, this new European law, that will have huge spillover effects, benefits for Americans. So all of the better explanations of what's going on, we'll get to read those too. All of the research outcomes, we will benefit from those too. So there are a bunch of upsides in transparency that come from the DSA. There are many things that the DSA does that the US could just never legislate, because, for example, it depends on having these big, robust new regulatory agencies. I don't think Congress is about to create a big, robust new regulatory agency, especially one that affects speech, but I could be wrong. On transparency, so I think that the super low-hanging fruit, and I'm guessing Laura might agree with me, the super low-hanging fruit is to protect researchers who scrape data from platforms in order to make their own assessments of what's going on. Because so many of the other transparency models are about platforms grading their own homework and issuing, descriptions of what they think is going on. And researchers like the researchers at NYU being able to look at what's actually showing up on people's screens and use that as a basis for research is essential. And right now, there are laws, antiquated laws, like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that make it so that those researchers are legally vulnerable and scared to do that. So that would be my #1 transparency ask for the US.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
At the microphone, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Dick Reisman, and I wanted to raise a reframing that I've been writing about in Tech Policy Press that I think brings together a lot of the ideas of this conference, which is, if you think about the process of thought, it's not an individual thing. It's a cycle of expression through a social mediation process back to impression and more thought. And the essence of it is the social mediation process that we've always had. Mass media changed that. The platforms co-opted it. And basically they don't amplify now, they propagate. So you really have to think about the preferential propagation as opposed to amplification like mass media. But the key is communities that are no longer part of the equation. And the middleware type approach would re-energize communities and recreate a social mediation ecosystem and bring back what I've been calling freedom of impression, which balances freedom of expression, so that there's no right of reach. So you can control it through impression without impeding expression. So all of the things that you're talking about of demoting, rather than removal, fit perfectly into that model. And that ties in with the agency and delegation of some of the legislation that's been talked about, like the Access Act. So I'm interested in your thoughts, and I think it ties in with the rest of the sessions as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to read it. It sounds really like an interesting thought. I think we are at a place where we have to step away from the way we've been asked to understand what's happening and rethink what it is the dynamics are of circulation of information entirely. And if that's an interesting one, that's going to be useful.
And I like the freedom of impression framing because it speaks to our rights as readers. We don't just have rights to speak, we have rights to decide what we want to read. And changes that empower us in that way, I think, can be very important.
I guess I don't want to let go entirely of the idea. Like, one thing that content moderation represents, although it's poorly and it's not always open, is like sometimes there's a place where the culture should discuss that something doesn't belong. And we do that through law sometimes, but we know there's these other categories. I don't want to entirely give up the idea that sometimes we have to grapple with what we want to choose not to see. It's really hard, especially in the American context, right? But I think having that done elsewhere or assuming it fits into a category and therefore not thinking about it, it loses an opportunity for the society to grapple with what it must face and what it shouldn't have to face. I think that question can't go away. I just don't know that content moderation does it in the way that we like.
There are lots more questions about selecting your own algorithm. So let me read out one question, and I'll just mention that there's going to be a talk about that in a future session. So and then I'll go to a different question for the panelists. The first one is, how do you feel about enabling users to design their own algorithms or move through their feed in a more active way through navigational levers? So that's the one we're going to have a talk about. A couple of people are wondering, is allowing users to tweak or choose their own algorithms for amplification, in allowing users to do that, do you think polarization would increase?
So I have like a standing list of the 5 problems with middleware. Even though I love, in some rooms I'm the pro middleware person, and in other rooms I'm saying, okay, number 1, if what you're worried about is echo chambers and people opting into the all hate all the time version of the internet, this does not solve that problem. Of course, that's the same problem we have with radio and cable TV and books. Like we are familiar with this problem, but I think it solves a lot of other problems, but that's the biggest policy objection. Then there are some practical objections. Privacy is the biggest one. I don't know a way, and I've been asking technologists for 2 or 3 years intensively if they know ways and they don't, to make it so that I can take my Facebook feed, which has privately shared information from my friends, and hand it to some third party to do the moderation. So then the third party sees my friend's private information, without my friend's consent. Like you can't do this without creating serious privacy questions. It's exactly the same problem as Cambridge Analytica. You can't hand this data off to the new competitor without a privacy and consent problem. Then there are a bunch, I have a piece in the Journal of Democracy about this. There are a bunch of questions about the costs of moderation, the economic incentives of the entities that are supposed to come along and provide this. But I think the privacy and the echo chambers are the biggest.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I just want to add to that, I'm always a fan of more user agency. I think one great example, on our team at Twitter, we were always asking the question of like, does this even need to be a machine learning model or an algorithm in the first place as opposed to something the user controls? And image cropping was an example of that explicitly happened on Twitter. But one thing you want to avoid, which I can't remember right now what company it was or what the product was. I think it was in a gaming context, but there was a situation where there was a prototype of something that had this user agency in terms of content that they wanted to see, and it was literally something like a toxicity slider or like a racism slider where they could just, say like, yeah, I'm opting into all this. I think that's not the vision that you want. I don't know what the right answer is, but I don't think you want the racism slider, so I just wanted to say that.
I think you can get that if you have a website or a service that's hosted on Amazon Web Services. They have automated tools. I bet Tarleton has written about this, called recognition, and I think it's pretty much a slider. You're like, oh, here's the amount of hate I want on my platform, or here's the tolerance I want to set for violence on my platform.
Right. It's such a fascinating question. I mean, this is where we get to like how much are we assigning to the kind of design of the system, and how much are we grappling with the sort of like the sadness of humanity, right? But the idea of like saying, oh, we know how to filter what we call hate or what we call toxic or whatever, but setting aside like who gets to define it and what falls into that category. Once you give the option, then we're like, ooh, do I want to give people the right to leave it open, right? Which is such a, like, that's a profound kind of rights question, a culture question. I think the question about finding your way into your own rabbit holes and polarization, we've always grappled with this, as you said. This is not a new question. I think there's an impulse that we haven't seen from the social media companies very much, which is providing a common object. And there's a talk later in this conference that's going to think about the way that public media impulses are designed to do that. There are common objects, but they come out of virality or they come out of trending. And we've had kickback reactions when platforms have tried to provide a common object, like, for instance, when Facebook wanted to make a box full of news reports and they got their teeth kicked in. Did it in really clumsy ways, but that was a, like, what if everyone should see this one thing? And there was a lot of anger about that. So there's a different question, but I do think in the traditional media environments, even just having to go to the bookstore, to even go buy the book I'm going to buy that confirms my own opinion, I have to encounter the fact that other books exist. And there is something about saying, like, I'm going to get to YouTube and it's going to be already populated with a front page that's already defined by my preferences and taste, calculated such, means that I don't even have that encounter. I don't even have the moment that says, oh, wow, a lot of people are paying attention to this, or this is something that seems to matter, even if I never read it. That's the subtleties of this kind of commonality versus our own navigation through it.
We have 1 minute left. We'll take the last question from Professor Nissenbaum.
Well, thank you, Helen Nissenbaum, Cornell Tech. Thank you for such an interesting, provocative panel. 2 quick stabs. One, Daphne, I know about the scraping of what's public in social media. I really worry, and again, it's like ChatGPT. Is someone going to say who's acceptable as the party? Like researchers at NYU, yes, but some other party to scrape, are we going to be able to establish standards? And my other concern is with this private algorithm. I want to define my own algorithm. The platforms can say, don't worry, guys, we're already doing that for you, because we know that these feeds are personalized to the particular party. So then, this is always the two-sided market personalization issue, and I wonder if the content moderation angle mixed with a personalization angle, how do we find our way out of that? Thank you for letting me.
So there are totally bad guy scrapers in the world, and so that what you asked is an essential question. I think a European answer could be good guy scrapers register with the regulator, and then the platform tolerates them. The US answer is probably there's a weird tort standard and we litigate over it. But you're right, that's like a real issue.
Okay, we'll end it there. We have a short 10-minute break. Let's thank the panelists.